Have you taken a moment to notice how grocery stores still glow with bright lights and neatly stocked aisles? At first glance, everything looks normal, almost abundant. Yet the quiet confidence that you can grab whatever you want, whenever you want it, doesn't feel quite the same anymore. That's because most things don't vanish overnight. Instead, they fade gradually. Products become harder to track down, appear sporadically, and then quietly disappear from your regular shopping habits without much notice at all. This isn't about panic buying or empty shelves showing up all at once. What's happening is more subtle. Supply chains are slowly weakening, strained by unpredictable weather patterns and behind-the-scenes shifts most shoppers never see. This video isn't a warning to rush out and hoard supplies. Rather, it's a calm look at 12 everyday grocery items that are becoming increasingly difficult to find. Not because people are suddenly buying more, but because the world itself is functioning differently now. If you've ever assumed these items would always be there, no matter what, stay with us until the end. Let's get started. Number 1. Organic apple cider vinegar. Organic apple cider vinegar is one of those pantry staples that quietly blends into the background of everyday life. It sits there for months at a time, rarely used and rarely replaced, until you almost forget it's something you might ever run out of. You don't reach for it daily, and you don't think to restock it often. Still, there's an unspoken belief that whenever you do need it, it'll be waiting right there on the shelf. That belief was formed during years when growing conditions were relatively steady and supply chains moved without interruption. Weather followed familiar patterns, harvests were dependable, and availability felt guaranteed. Then one day, you're standing in the grocery aisle and something feels off. The shelf is full of options. White vinegar, rice vinegar, and all the lower-cost alternatives are neatly arranged just like always. But the organic apple cider vinegar is missing. There's no warning sign, no explanation, no out-of-stock label, just a blank space where it used to be. Most people assume it's a temporary hiccup. But the truth is, organic apple cider vinegar doesn't vanish because shoppers suddenly bought more of it. It fades away because organic apples themselves are becoming less predictable to produce. Organic apple farming depends heavily on consistent weather. There's no heavy chemical buffering and no aggressive intervention to correct problems. A single late rainy season, an extended heat wave, or a frost that hits too early can disrupt an entire harvest at its foundation. On top of that, apple cider vinegar isn't something manufacturers can rush to market. It requires time to ferment and stable conditions to develop properly. When apples become harder to source, production slows naturally. Faced with limited raw materials, producers have to prioritize. Items that sell quickly and generate faster returns move to the front of the line. Organic apple cider vinegar usually doesn't make that cut. What's most striking is how quietly it all happens. There's no alarm, no frantic buying, no dramatic shortage. People simply switch to another option and move on. And it's that silent adjustment that makes organic apple cider vinegar such a clear example of how familiar products can slip away unnoticed. It isn't disappearing because of a sudden crisis. It's becoming harder to find because the steady conditions it relies on are slowly eroding. Number 2. Pure honey. Honey is one of the rare foods humans have never fully mastered or controlled. We can cultivate crops, raise animals, and even manipulate growing environments with technology. Honey, however, operates on entirely different rules. Its existence depends on a tiny, delicate insect that is highly sensitive to even the smallest environmental shifts. For a long time, honey was a grocery store constant. Few people questioned its origin or the process behind it. You simply trusted that a jar would always be waiting on the shelf whenever you needed one. That sense of familiarity is exactly why many shoppers miss the early signs that honey is one of the first products to reflect deeper instability in the natural world. In recent years, beekeepers have started sharing a concerning pattern. Bees aren't vanishing in dramatic die-offs or creating alarming headlines. Instead, they quietly disappear. Colonies thin out. Activity drops. And the absence is subtle enough to go unnoticed by most people. Extended heat causes flowers to bloom at the wrong times. Wildfires erase entire wildflower regions. Unseasonal rainfall interferes with bees' ability to navigate and return to their hives. When nature's rhythm falls out of sync, bees are among the earliest to be affected. What makes honey different is that it doesn't vanish right away. Store shelves still look stocked because those jars were produced from past harvests. But as those reserves slowly diminish, the new supply often isn't enough to fully replace them. When that imbalance appears, the market doesn't respond with alarm. It adjusts quietly. Pure honey becomes diluted. Labels grow less specific. The flavor shifts just enough to be noticeable only if you're paying close attention. In the past, honey's greatest strength was its natural purity. Today, that same dependence on nature has turned into a vulnerability. Bees can't be pushed to produce more, ecosystems can't be rushed, and supply chains can't manufacture what they don't control. Pure honey isn't becoming scarce because people suddenly want more of it. It's harder to find because nature itself is slowly pulling back the stability we once assumed would always be there. You might not have consciously noticed it, but think back to the last time you bought honey. Did the texture, the taste, or even the wording on the label feel slightly different than it did a few years ago? Or have we simply adjusted to a world where normal isn't quite what it used to be? Number 3. Fresh leafy greens. Lettuce, spinach, and other leafy greens make one reality very clear. Not all food is built to survive unstable weather. You can store rice, you can stockpile canned goods. But leafy greens don't wait patiently on shelves or in warehouses. They live one day at a time, and they spoil just as quickly. A stretch of extra heat lasting only a few days can scorch young leaves before they ever reach maturity. One unexpected downpour can oversaturate the soil, rot the roots, and wipe out an entire field in a matter of hours. With leafy greens, there's no recovery period and no backup plan. Unlike fruit trees that can survive a bad season and try again next year, greens don't get a second chance. When weather patterns fall out of sync, they're often the first crops to fail. What's interesting is how quietly this shows up in stores. You rarely see signs warning of a vegetable shortage. No announcements, no explanations. Instead, you notice it indirectly. The produce section looks full in the morning, but by afternoon it's already thinning out. The next day, shelves are restocked, but something feels different. The selection has changed. The leaves are smaller, slightly wilted, and the prices are higher in a way that's hard to justify or explain. This cycle repeats often enough that you start questioning your own memory. Were leafy greens always this inconsistent, or have they really become harder to buy? One viewer summed it up with a short but honest observation. I used to shop for groceries once a week. Now I have to go twice just to catch fresh vegetables. Leafy greens don't vanish entirely. They simply stop being dependable. And that quiet unreliability slowly reshapes daily routines without ever announcing itself. More than anything else, leafy greens are an early signal. When the climate begins to shift, the most delicate foods are often the first to tell the story. Number 4. Dried chilies and fresh chilies. Chilies are a unique kind of ingredient. You don't use much of them at a time, but when they're missing, the absence is immediate and unmistakable. It's not about hunger, it's about flavor. A meal without heat often feels incomplete, as if something familiar has quietly been removed. Spice isn't a necessity for survival, yet for millions of households, it's woven into everyday cooking. The issue with chilies has nothing to do with people suddenly craving hotter food. Demand hasn't changed in any meaningful way. The real challenge is where chilies come from. They rely on a small number of specific growing regions, and many of those areas are now facing prolonged drought and extreme temperatures. Chilies thrive in sunlight, but sustained heat beyond a certain point damages the plants. They prefer dry conditions, but soil that's cracked and depleted offers no chance of survival. Once weather patterns cross that threshold, an entire growing season can be lost before it even begins. What makes this especially fragile is the chain reaction that follows. When fresh chili harvests shrink, dried chilies lose their source. When dried chilies become scarce, everything made from them, sauces, seasonings, and spice blends, starts to feel the impact. This doesn't happen overnight, it unfolds gradually. One variety goes missing first. A familiar brand disappears the following week. Then, without realizing it, you notice that the chili you normally buy hasn't shown up in weeks. One viewer described it perfectly. I didn't panic when chilies weren't there. I just started buying whatever was left, even if it wasn't what I liked. Chilies don't vanish completely. Instead, they become a clear illustration of how food availability weakens quietly when weather stability breaks down. There's no announcement, no warning, just familiar options slipping away before you have time to question it. Have you ever caught yourself reaching for a substitute? Not because you wanted it, but because it was the only option left on the shelf? And at what point did choosing what you enjoy turn into choosing whatever happens to be available? Number 5. Almonds. Almonds are often seen as a good choice. They're linked to health, mindful eating, and the feeling that you're doing something right for your body. A small bag might sit unnoticed in a kitchen drawer or a handbag, ready whenever you need a quick, reliable snack. What most people rarely stop to consider is what almonds rely on to stay so consistently available. The answer is simple and increasingly scarce. Water. Almonds are among the most water-demanding crops in agriculture. At the same time, the majority of almonds sold today come from California, a region where drought is no longer an occasional problem, but a long-term reality. When water becomes limited, it stops being distributed according to consumer demand. It's redirected toward essential needs, households, cities, and basic human use. Crops that require large volumes of water are forced into question, and almonds sit high on that list. What's striking is how slowly this shift unfolds. You don't walk into a store and find the almond section empty. Instead, the bags shrink. The prices quietly climb. The range of choices narrows. Over time, familiar brands disappear, replaced by options you don't quite recognize. This isn't a sudden shortage or a dramatic event. It's a gradual recalibration that happens slowly enough for shoppers to adjust without realizing they've adjusted at all. One viewer summed it up with a simple observation. I still see almonds. I just don't buy them the way I used to. Almonds aren't becoming scarce because people are eating more of them. They're harder to find because, in a world facing water limitations, foods that are healthy but not essential are being reevaluated. And if you look at the bag of nuts in your kitchen today, you might find yourself wondering, when did buying almonds stop feeling like such an obvious choice? Number 6. Oranges and fresh orange juice. Oranges are so deeply woven into everyday life that most people never imagine them becoming difficult to find. A morning glass of orange juice, the scent of a freshly peeled orange in the kitchen, these small moments feel ordinary, almost guaranteed. That sense of normalcy, however, masks a reality that has been shifting quietly year after year. Today, oranges are facing pressure from several directions at the same time. Extreme weather has made harvest seasons increasingly unpredictable. Strong storms knock fruit from trees before it has a chance to mature. Extended periods of heat weaken the trees themselves, leaving them more vulnerable than before. As trees lose strength, disease spreads more easily, and when illness takes hold in an orange grove, it isn't something that clears up in a single season. It lingers, sometimes for years, gradually reducing how much fruit the trees can produce. What often goes unnoticed is how these shortages actually appear. You don't walk into a store and see empty bins where oranges once were. Instead, the fruit is smaller. The selection is narrower. Prices rise slowly, almost imperceptibly, from one trip to the next. Bottled orange juice still shows up on shelves, but not with the consistency people expect. One week, it's fully stocked. The next, it's gone, only to reappear weeks later. That on and off availability creates the illusion that everything is still functioning normally. Oranges don't disappear the moment trees begin to struggle, and orange juice doesn't decline immediately when fresh fruit becomes harder to source. By the time shoppers start noticing changes, the supply chain has already weakened deep at its foundation. At that stage, shopping habits adjust quietly and naturally, without much thought or discussion. So maybe the question is no longer why orange juice costs more. Instead, it's this. In the years ahead, will oranges remain something you toss into your cart without a second thought? Or will they become a purchase you pause to consider before deciding? Number 7. Coffee. People don't drink coffee because they need calories. They drink it because of habit and rhythm. Skipping a morning cup won't make you collapse, but it can throw the entire day slightly off balance, simply because coffee is so deeply embedded in daily routine. That's why many assume it will always be available, no matter what. Coffee isn't becoming harder to find because consumption has suddenly increased. The real issue lies in the plant itself. Coffee trees are extremely sensitive to unstable weather. An early frost can cause blossoms to drop before they ever form beans. Unexpected heavy rain can flood the roots. Prolonged heat stresses the plants and weakens their ability to produce. These conditions don't wipe out coffee farms overnight. Instead, they reduce harvest gradually and persistently. What makes this especially risky is the delay. One poor season doesn't end when the year does. It affects the seasons that follow. Trees need time to recover, and soil needs time to restore balance. At the same time, demand remains largely unchanged. The result isn't empty shelves all at once, but something subtler. Favorite varieties slowly disappear, prices rise bit by bit, and quality becomes less consistent from bag to bag. One viewer summed it up in a simple comment: "I can still buy coffee, just not the one I usually drink." Coffee itself isn't vanishing. What's changing is the reliability of the routine built around it. And when something so closely tied to daily rhythm becomes uncertain, the disruption eventually makes itself felt. So if tomorrow morning your usual coffee isn't available, do you reach for a substitute? Or do you accept that the day starts slightly incomplete? And what does that reveal about the stability we once believed was guaranteed? Number 8. Chocolate and cocoa. Chocolate is rarely a planned purchase. Most people buy it on impulse, guided by mood rather than necessity. Because it isn't considered essential, changes in availability or quality often go unnoticed at first. People adjust without realizing they've adjusted. That sense of indulgence is exactly what allows cocoa, the key ingredient behind chocolate, to slip quietly into a vulnerable position. Cocoa is grown in only a narrow band of the world, and those regions happen to be among the most affected by climate instability. Heavy rainfall creates ideal conditions for plant diseases to spread rapidly. Extended heat drains cocoa trees of the energy they need to produce healthy pods. Cocoa doesn't fail all at once. It weakens over time. Harvests shrink from season to season. Flavor and consistency begin to change long before production numbers fully collapse. When cocoa supplies become uncertain, manufacturers are forced to make careful decisions. Premium products are protected and sold in smaller markets where higher prices are accepted. Meanwhile, the familiar chocolate bars meant for everyday shoppers start showing up less often. They don't vanish overnight. Instead, they become sporadic, more expensive, and subtly different in taste from what people remember buying out of habit. Chocolate is still there, but something about the experience changes. You pause longer in the aisle. You compare labels more carefully. Sometimes you walk away from an item that once brought simple enjoyment because it no longer feels worth the price or the compromise. Cocoa itself isn't gone. What's fading is the ease and certainty with which chocolate used to be an effortless choice. Number 9. Canned fish, sardines, and salmon. Canned fish isn't usually bought for tonight's dinner. People keep it for reassurance. It sits quietly in the cupboard as a kind of backup, something you expect to be there whenever you need it. Because of that sense of security, most people rarely think about what it takes to keep it consistently available. What often goes unnoticed is that canned fish depends entirely on the part of the system changing the fastest, the ocean itself. As ocean temperatures rise, currents shift. Fish stop gathering in the places fisheries have relied on for generations. They move farther away, dive deeper, and become much harder to predict. That uncertainty disrupts what used to be stable fishing seasons. Some years produce strong catches, while others fall far short. For processors, planning becomes guesswork rather than routine. When supply turns uneven, the industry has to make choices. Fresh fish is prioritized first. Frozen products come next. Canned fish, which doesn't require immediate sale, is often pushed to the back of the line, not because it isn't valued, but because it can be delayed. The result isn't empty shelves. Canned fish almost always remains visible in stores. What fades instead is familiarity. The brand you trust appears less often. The specific variety you rely on becomes inconsistent. And before long, you find yourself spending more time in front of the shelf searching for something that once took no effort at all. Canned fish isn't harder to find because people suddenly started eating more of it. It's becoming less reliable because the ocean is no longer following the predictable patterns it once did. Number 10. Imported instant noodles and convenience foods. Imported convenience foods exist only when the global system is running smoothly. You rarely think about them because, until recently, everything behind the scenes worked like clockwork. Ships moved on schedule. Shipping containers were affordable. Fuel costs were predictable. Products arrived where they were supposed to, exactly when they were expected. That sense of reliability disappears the moment even one part of the system falls out of sync. Storms delay ships at sea. Extreme weather pushes fuel prices higher. Containers become harder to secure and more expensive to use. None of this empties store shelves overnight, but it makes every shipment slower, riskier, and far more costly. As expenses rise, retailers are forced to reassess what they carry. They don't eliminate products all at once. Instead, they begin with items that aren't essential and come from far away. Imported instant foods fit that category perfectly. Domestic products are favored because they travel shorter distances, arrive faster, and are easier to manage. Their prices fluctuate less, and their supply feels more controllable. This transition is never announced. There's no notice on the shelf. One day, you simply realize the brand you always grabbed is gone. The shelves are still stocked, just with alternatives. Different origins, similar flavors. Close enough to substitute, but not the one you used to choose automatically. Imported instant foods don't vanish suddenly. They're replaced slowly and quietly. By the time you've adjusted to a new option, the old favorite has already slipped out of your routine without you ever noticing the moment it happened. So maybe the question isn't when it will disappear. Maybe it's this. When was the last time you bought something simply because your usual choice wasn't available? And have you noticed how often that's starting to happen? Perhaps the issue isn't shortage at all, but how easily we're adapting to substitution. So much so that we're beginning to forget what our first choice even was. Number 11. Premium canned foods, organic soups, and broths. Premium canned foods aren't usually purchased out of necessity. People choose them for ease, for the sense that they're making a slightly healthier decision, and for a reassuring idea. No matter how busy life becomes, there's still something decent waiting in the pantry. That sense of comfort is exactly why many assume these products will always be available. But within the supply chain, premium canned goods aren't treated as essentials. When ingredient prices rise, transportation costs climb, and profit margins tighten, manufacturers are forced to rethink what they can sustain. In those moments, priority goes to products that move quickly, sell in large volumes, and return capital fast. Organic soups, specialty broths, and smaller label items, even when they're high quality, often become liabilities in a survival-focused calculation. What's striking is how silently this shift occurs. There's no public announcement, no explanation, and no notice of discontinuation. Production simply stops. The final batch sells through, and the shelf is filled with something new. That's why you rarely encounter an obvious gap. The shelves still look stocked. Fresh labels appear. New options take the place of old ones. Yet the product you used to reach for, the one you trusted, enjoyed, and bought without hesitation, never quite returns. The change happens slowly enough that you begin to question your own memory. Premium canned foods don't vanish because they aren't useful. They fade away because, when costs tighten, items that are good but not essential are often the first to be let go. And maybe the quietest question of all is this. The last time you went shopping, how many times did you find yourself choosing something different, simply because the familiar option was no longer there? Number 12. Active dry yeast. Yeast may be the quietest item on this entire list. It isn't something you buy regularly, and it's rarely on your mind during a normal grocery run. It sits unnoticed in a cabinet, small, plain, and easy to overlook. Yet when the moment comes that you actually need it, it suddenly becomes essential. You can have bags of flour ready to go, but without yeast, everything stops. What makes this ironic is that yeast doesn't become hard to find because the raw ingredients disappear. Wheat is still grown. Flour still fills the shelves. Yeast becomes scarce for a different reason. It's produced in cycles, has a limited shelf life, and isn't treated as a priority when supply chains tighten. When factories are forced to choose what to make first, they focus on products that sell quickly and move constantly. Yeast, seen as non-urgent, gets pushed further down the list. This kind of shortage never arrives with noise or urgency. No one rushes out to hoard yeast. There are no headlines and no panic. You only notice it at a very specific moment, when you're standing in front of the shelf, ready to bake. The flour is there. The sugar is there. But the yeast is missing. Not missing all the time, just missing when you actually need it. Yeast doesn't vanish from stores entirely. It disappears at the exact moment it matters most. And that's what makes it the most fragile item on this list. Not because it's expensive, but because its importance only becomes clear once it's already unavailable. Which leads to a larger question worth ending on. In your kitchen right now, how many items do you assume will always be available, but only exist because of a stability we're no longer sure we can maintain? By this point, you may have noticed something important. The shelves aren't empty. What's fading is reliability. Familiar stability is slowly pulling back. These products don't vanish all at once. They become inconsistent, harder to find, less dependable than before. And without any warning, they quietly force changes in how you shop, cook, and plan. Natural disruptions rarely create immediate shock. Instead, they weaken supply systems gradually, until one day you're standing in a grocery aisle wondering, why has this suddenly become so difficult to buy? So perhaps the real question isn't which item is missing. It's this. How many things in your kitchen do you still believe will always be there? If you've noticed that shift, share your experience. It might be exactly what someone else is only just beginning to sense.